"I never died," she said, standing before the man who believed he had lost her forever. For 2 years he lived in solitary grief, unaware that the truth had been hidden from him. Now, with her eyes locked on his, she carries secrets that could change everything left between them. But neither he nor the world is ready for what she is about to reveal. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now on with the story. New York never sleeps, and maybe that's why Chloe Miller chose that city to build her life. The frantic pace matched her energy, a 35-year-old woman who turned ideas into reality with an ease that impressed everyone. Alongside Ethan Davis, her partner of 8 years, she had created something that went far beyond a simple company. Miller and Davis Social Development was the reflection of a shared dream, a project that started small and became a national benchmark when it came to corporate social responsibility. Ethan was 40, with a serious demeanor that sometimes intimidated those who didn't know him, but a generous heart that Chloe discovered on their very first date. They met at a lecture on social entrepreneurship at NYU, and they had been inseparable ever since. What began as a professional partnership quickly blossomed into a life partnership. They married 3 years later in a simple ceremony in upstate New York, Chloe's home turf, with fewer than 50 guests and a whole lot of emotion. The company grew along with their relationship. They started by advising small businesses that wanted to structure social projects, and within a few years, they were coordinating large-scale programs, connecting corporations to underserved communities across the tri-state area. Chloe handled operations and community relations, while Ethan managed finances and strategic partnerships. They worked in harmony, like a finely tuned orchestra, and it showed in their results. They had 42 employees, offices in 3 different cities, and an impeccable reputation in the market. Their life followed a comfortable and predictable routine. They lived in a spacious apartment in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn, overlooking a tree-lined street where Chloe loved to sip her coffee every morning, watching the city wake up. Ethan had a habit of waking up before her, brewing fresh coffee with that aroma that had become part of her morning ritual, and leaving a cup on her nightstand with a sweet note. Sometimes it was just a silly drawing of a heart, other times a sentence about how lucky he felt to have her by his side. Small gestures that supported the solidity of their relationship, like invisible bricks in an emotional foundation. On weekends, they escaped to their beach house in the Hamptons, a simple but cozy refuge they had bought 3 years ago, after a lot of saving. There, far from the incessantly ringing phones and endless meetings, they could disconnect from work and reconnect with each other. They would walk along the beach at dawn, hand in hand, planning the future. They talked about having kids one day, about expanding the company to other states, about growing old together in that same house, watching the sea from the window. They were simple conversations, but filled with certainty, the certainty that they would be together always. But something began to change in May of that year. Chloe started coming home later, always with excuses about meetings that ran long or community visits that took more time than expected. Ethan, trusting his partner completely, never questioned it. He believed she was just more involved with a new project, maybe something she wanted to surprise him with later. Their trust was absolute, built over years of genuine partnership. But the changes were too subtle to be just professional fatigue. Something deeper was happening, something Chloe was keeping to herself with a weight that was beginning to bend her shoulders. Chloe started checking 2, 3 times if the apartment door was locked before going to sleep. She would get up in the middle of the night and walk through the apartment, looking out the windows as if searching for something or someone. Ethan would wake to the sound of her footsteps and find her standing by the living room window watching the silent street below. When he asked if everything was okay, she would smile and say it was just insomnia, that it would pass soon. But he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she held the curtain. Her phone, once always open and accessible, was now password protected. She started taking calls in another room, always in a low voice, always quickly. Ethan felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't name the unsettling feeling that was beginning to take root in his chest. It was early June when Chloe attended a meeting in the South Bronx to evaluate the progress of a job training project the company had been coordinating for 2 years. The project was funded by a major multinational corporation and served over 300 families. Chloe arrived on site excited, as she always was. When visiting the communities, she loved talking to the participants, hearing their stories, understanding how the program was impacting their lives. But that day, something different happened. During the meeting with the local coordinators, Chloe noticed inconsistencies in the financial reports. Some numbers didn't add up. Expenses seemed inflated. Invoices were duplicated. Payments didn't correspond to the services rendered. At first, she thought it might just be an accounting error, something simple to fix. But when she asked to see the original documents, the resistance was immediate. The coordinators exchanged uncomfortable glances, made up excuses, and said they would need more time to gather the paperwork. A chill ran down Chloe's spine. She knew this kind of behavior. She had worked in auditing before starting her own company and knew how to tell when someone was hiding something. It was like a sixth sense developed over the years, an ability to read between the lines and spot inconsistencies. She decided to investigate on her own, but carefully. She couldn't raise suspicion or alert whoever was behind it. She began requesting documents directly from vendors, always with reasonable excuses. She cross-referenced information between different spreadsheets and requested bank statements, claiming the need for an internal audit. She worked through the dead of night, when Ethan was already asleep, organizing data on a laptop she kept with her at all times. What she discovered left her floored. There was an organized and sophisticated scheme to embezzle funds. Money that should have been invested in the families was being systematically siphoned off through shell companies, fake invoices, and services that were never provided. And most alarmingly, important people were involved. Local politicians who sat on the project's advisory boards, members of the board of the funding company, that multinational everyone admired for its social commitment, and worse, even some employees from Miller and Davis itself, people Chloe trusted, people she had bet her professional career on. The discovery was like a betrayal multiplied by 1,000. Chloe was paralyzed by the revelation. She had built her company on ethical values, on transparency, on a genuine commitment to social change. To discover that her company was being used for money laundering, even without her knowledge, felt like a punch to the gut. She had to report it, but to whom? The people involved had power, connections, resources. Chloe knew she was facing something much bigger than she had imagined. For 2 weeks she gathered evidence. She copied documents, recorded conversations, photographed receipts. She stored everything on a flash drive that she hid in a shoebox in the back of her closet. She didn't tell Ethan anything. She wanted to protect him. She believed that if he knew nothing, he would be safe. But Chloe underestimated the reach of these people. They had eyes everywhere. The first threat came via a text message from an unknown number. Short and to the point. Stop asking inconvenient questions. It would be healthier for everyone. Chloe ignored it. The second came 2 days later, more explicit. She had a good life, a marriage, a company. It would be a shame to lose it all over excessive curiosity. That's when Chloe understood she was in real danger. She began to change her habits. She started taking different routes home, avoiding places she frequented, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Fear became her constant companion. And the worst part was having to pretend everything was normal in front of Ethan, who was already starting to realize something was very wrong. One Saturday night, as they were having dinner at home, Ethan finally confronted Chloe. He held her hand and asked, his eyes full of concern, what was going on. Chloe wanted to tell him everything. The words were on the tip of her tongue, but fear was stronger. If she told him, Ethan would be involved. If he was involved, he would become a target too. She couldn't let that happen, so she lied. She said she was just stressed with a difficult project, but that everything would be back to normal soon. Ethan didn't completely believe her, but he respected her space. 3 days later, Chloe was driving home after a meeting in Midtown when she realized she was being followed. A gray sedan with no visible license plates kept the same distance. She sped up, turned onto side streets, tried to lose it, but the car was still there. Panic washed over her. She decided not to go home. She couldn't bring that danger to Ethan. She parked in front of a police precinct and just sat there, inside her car, trembling, until the gray sedan finally drove away. It was that night that Chloe made the hardest decision of her life. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't live in fear, always looking over her shoulder, putting Ethan at risk. The people behind that scheme wouldn't stop. They had the resources to get to her in every possible way. And what if they did something to Ethan to pressure her? What if they used her love against her? Chloe couldn't live with that possibility. She thought about going to the police, but the threats made it clear there was infiltration at various levels of power. She thought about exposing everything publicly, but she couldn't guarantee her safety afterward. Every option seemed to lead to a dead end. It was then that an idea began to form in her mind. A terrible, painful idea, but perhaps the only way to protect the one she loved and, at the same time, keep alive the possibility of one day exposing the truth. Chloe would have to disappear completely, not just move to another city or change her name. She would have to make everyone believe she was no longer around, permanently. Only then would the criminals stop looking for her. Only then would Ethan be safe. The idea was absurd, cruel, unthinkable, but there it was, growing in her mind like a poisonous plant she couldn't uproot. Over the next few days, Chloe planned every detail. She researched, studied possibilities, and looked for people who could help her. She found a retired doctor, Dr. Wallace, who had worked in public hospitals for over 30 years and now lived a reclusive life in the countryside. He had his own reasons for being willing to help someone who needed to disappear. Chloe didn't ask what they were. She just accepted the help. The plan was complex and involved creating a situation that left no room for doubt. There needed to be an event, traumatic enough that no one would question it. Dr. Wallace knew people who could provide documents, who could make it seem like something irreversible had happened. It had to be convincing, painfully convincing. Chloe spent the last week before executing the plan watching Ethan intensely. She mentally recorded his every gesture, every smile, every word. She knew these would be the last real memories she would have of him for an indefinite time, maybe forever. The guilt was a weight in her chest that made it hard to breathe. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered the grey sedan, the threats, the real danger that surrounded them both. On the morning of June 23rd, a typical Monday, Chloe woke up before her alarm. Ethan was still asleep beside her. She lay there, just looking at him, memorizing the lines of the face she loved. She got up slowly, made coffee as she always did, and left a note on the nightstand. A note too short to contain everything she wanted to say. Just a few words about leaving early for an urgent meeting. Empty words to fill the silence that was to come. Chloe left the house, with a small suitcase hidden in the trunk of her car. She drove to the meeting point she had arranged with Dr. Wallace on a secondary road near White Plains, about 40 miles from the city. There, the doctor was already waiting with another car. Chloe transferred her essential belongings, handed over the keys to her own vehicle, and watched as Dr. Wallace carried out the most difficult part of the plan. Hours later, the news reached Ethan through a call from the police. A terrible incident on a quiet road. A vehicle had been involved in an unexpected incident, and the result was devastating. The documents found at the scene indicated it was Chloe Miller. The evidence pointed to an irreversible situation. A visual identification wouldn't be possible due to the circumstances. Only personal effects could confirm the identity. Ethan felt his world collapse. His legs gave out, his vision went dark, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. His younger brother, Leo, who was visiting the apartment that day, rushed to support him. The officer's words echoed in his head, but nothing made sense. Chloe couldn't be gone like this. Not in this abrupt way, without warning, without one last conversation. He had woken up next to her that morning. How could he have missed the chance to say he loved her one more time? The days that followed were a blur of incomprehensible pain. Ethan could barely get out of bed, could barely eat. Leo took control of the situation, handling the necessary procedures, organizing the memorial service. Friends, family, business partners, everyone came to offer support, but Ethan couldn't hear anything beyond the deafening silence of Chloe's absence. The service was held on a rainy June day at Greenwood Cemetery. Hundreds of people attended, all dressed in black, all sharing the same expression of shock and sadness. There were emotional speeches about Chloe's work, her commitment to the communities, the difference she made in so many people's lives. But for Ethan, none of it mattered. He was there, facing an irreversible situation, having to accept the unacceptable, having to say goodbye to the person he still loved with every fiber of his being. What Ethan didn't know was that just a few miles away, Chloe was hidden in a small rented apartment in a peripheral neighborhood in Queens, watching the rain fall. From her window, crying silently, knowing that at that very moment the man she loved was going through the worst pain of his life, and she was the cause of that pain. Chloe knew there would be no forgiveness for what she was doing. She knew she was destroying Ethan from the inside out, but she still believed it was the only way to keep him alive and safe. Still, as the rain washed over the streets of New York, she wondered if she would have the strength to bear the weight of this choice, if she would ever be able to look at herself in the mirror again without feeling disgust, if there would ever really be a day when she could return, or if she had just built her own permanent prison. That night, as Ethan returned home empty and broken, as Leo tried to find words of comfort that didn't exist, as the city continued its indifferent rhythm, Chloe made a decision. She would hold on to the evidence she had gathered. She would wait for the right moment. And when that moment came, she would make it all worthwhile, or at least she would try to, find some meaning in this self-inflicted tragedy. But for now, all she could do was endure day after day the torture of knowing she had erased her own existence from the life of the person she loved most in the world. The first few months were a descent into an abyss with no end in sight. Ethan would wake up every morning and, for a few blessed seconds of unconsciousness, forget what had happened. His hand would automatically reach for the left side of the bed, searching for the warmth of Chloe's body, the comforting touch that had been with him for 8 years. Then reality would crash down on him like a ton of bricks, crushing his chest, stealing his breath, and the weight was always unbearable. Some days he would simply turn his face to the pillow and cry silently until he had no strength left. The apartment in Park Slope, once a home full of life, laughter, and shared projects, had become a mausoleum of painful memories. Every corner held a piece of Chloe that Ethan couldn't forget. Her favorite mug, the one with flower designs she'd bought at a craft fair, was still in the cabinet, on the top shelf exactly where she always left it. Her clothes still hung in the closet, organized by color as she liked, because Ethan couldn't even think about getting rid of them. Her perfume, that citrus and floral scent that was so distinctly her, still lingered in the air when he opened the closet. Or maybe it was just his desperate imagination trying to keep her alive somehow. There were days when Ethan would open the closet just to smell it, to close his eyes and pretend for a few seconds that she was still there. Leo, his younger brother, moved into the apartment temporarily. At 32, he had always been the opposite of Ethan. Where the older brother was serious and methodical, Leo was spontaneous and outgoing. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave him the flexibility to be there during this difficult time. But not even all of Leo's energy and determination could pull Ethan out of the pit he had fallen into. He would prepare meals that Ethan barely touched. He would open the curtains in the morning, but Ethan would close them again. He would try to start conversations about anything, only to be met with heavy silence. The company began to feel the devastating effects of both their absences. Chloe was the operational soul, the person who kept projects running with efficiency and care, who visited the communities regularly, who knew every beneficiary by name and their life stories. She was the one who ensured everything worked with excellence, that deadlines were met, that quality was never compromised. Ethan was the structure, the meticulous strategist, the one who guaranteed financial sustainability through well-negotiated partnerships and careful planning. Without Chloe, and with Ethan unable to function, completely lost in his own grief, Miller and Davis began to crumble like a house of cards. Meetings were cancelled at the last minute. Missed deadlines led to fines and strained relationships with partners. Reports were delivered late and full of inconsistencies. Clients began to seriously question the company's ability to continue operating, and some were already looking for alternatives in the market. The company phone, which once rang incessantly with opportunities, now brought more collections calls and complaints than anything else. Jessica Carter, the project manager, and one of the longest-serving employees, took temporary command. A competent and dedicated woman in her 40s, she did her best to keep things running. But without clear direction, without strategic decisions being made, the situation was unsustainable. She tried to talk to Ethan a few times, but he could barely hold a coherent conversation. His answers were monosyllabic, his eyes empty. Jessica knew she couldn't hold down the fort alone for much longer. 3 months after Chloe's disappearance, the company lost its biggest contract. The multinational that funded the project in the South Bronx, the very one where Chloe had discovered the irregularities, decided not to renew the partnership. The official reason was internal reorganization, but everyone knew. The real reason was a lack of confidence in Miller and Davis's ability to continue delivering results. That contract represented 40% of the company's revenue. Losing it meant having to lay off employees, cut projects, and drastically reduce operations. It was Leo who broke the news to Ethan. He found his brother sitting on the living room couch in the same spot where he spent most of his days, staring into space. Leo sat next to him, took a deep breath, and told him about the lost contract, about the layoffs that would be necessary, about the 42 families who depended on those jobs. Ethan listened in silence. When Leo finished, expecting some reaction, some plan, some spark of the determined man his brother had always been, Ethan simply stood up and walked to the bedroom, closing the door behind him. Leo punched a couch cushion in frustration. He understood his brother's pain, but he also saw the domino effect of the tragedy. It wasn't just Ethan who was suffering. It was dozens of families, hundreds of people in the communities served by their projects, an entire network of social impact that was about to disappear. Anger grew in his chest. Anger at the situation, anger at a cruel fate, even anger at Chloe for leaving in such an absurd way and leaving everything and everyone in ruins. That night, for the first time in months, Ethan left the apartment of his own accord. Leo woke to the sound of the door closing at 3 in the morning and ran to the window just in time to see his brother getting into his car. He thought about following him, but something made him hesitate. Ethan needed space, time, a way to process it all. So Leo stayed there, at the window, waiting and hoping his brother would return safe and sound. Ethan drove through the empty streets of New York until he reached Greenwood Cemetery. Even at night, he knew every turn of the way. He had been there every single day since the service, without exception. He parked in front of the closed gate but didn't care. He hopped the low wall, something he had done a few times when he arrived after hours, and walked through the silent paths until he reached the spot where Chloe's name was engraved in cold marble. He sat on the damp grass, leaning his back against the headstone, and for the first time in 3 months he truly cried. These weren't the silent tears of restrained sadness. It was a violent, desperate cry, the kind that rips sounds from the depths of your throat and leaves your whole body aching. Ethan cried until he had no tears left, until his throat was raw, until the sky began to lighten on the horizon. It was there, in that cold September dawn, that Ethan made a decision. He couldn't just give up. Chloe wouldn't have wanted that. She had dedicated her life to making a difference, to helping people, to building something bigger than themselves. If he allowed everything to fall apart, he would be erasing her legacy. He would be killing Chloe a second time, and he couldn't forgive himself for that. Ethan returned home when the sun was already high. Leo, who hadn't slept a wink, saw his brother walk in with swollen eyes, but with something different in his gaze. There was determination there, still pain, a lot of pain, but also purpose. Ethan took a shower, put on clean clothes for the first time in weeks, and asked Leo to schedule a meeting with the entire team for the next day. The meeting was difficult. Ethan was visibly fragile, but he stood firm. He apologized for his absence, acknowledged that he had failed everyone, and presented a restructuring plan. Some employees would have to be let go, that was unavoidable, but he would ensure they all received fair severance packages and letters of recommendation. Those who stayed would have to work harder, with fewer resources. But he would be there with them, in the trenches, rebuilding everything brick by brick. Jessica was the first to stand up and shake Ethan's hand. The others followed. There were tears, hugs, and a moment of unity amidst the chaos. It wouldn't be easy, but at least there was a path forward. Miller and Davis would not die with Chloe. Not if Ethan could help it. While Ethan fought to rebuild his life and his company piece by piece, Chloe lived a private and silent hell in the small rented apartment in Queens. The place was tiny, with just one bedroom, a living room that barely fit an old couch, and a kitchen the size of a closet. It was sparsely furnished, with peeling walls and a musty smell that never quite went away, on a noisy street in Astoria, where trucks rumbled by all through the night. She had deliberately chosen a place where no one would know her, where she could pass completely unnoticed among hundreds of other anonymous people living their hurried, indifferent lives. Chloe wore an itchy brown wig, prescription glasses she didn't need that gave her constant headaches, and simple, styleless clothes bought at thrift stores. She avoided conversations with neighbors at all costs, passing them on the stairs or in the hallway with just a brief nod. Before quickening her pace, she only went out to buy essentials at the corner market, always paying in cash to leave no electronic trail, always with the hood of her sweatshirt pulled over part of her face, always quick and efficient, like someone afraid of being seen. The days were endless and monotonous, filled with a suffocating emptiness. Chloe spent hours and hours online, sitting on the old couch that creaked with every movement, obsessively following news about the company, about Ethan, about everything she had left behind. She created several fake social media profiles just to see photos, read posts, and see comments from friends and colleagues, to feel minimally connected to the life she had so brutally abandoned. Every photo of Ethan was a direct stab to the heart. She saw the suffering etched on his face, every new line of expression marked by pain, the progressive weight loss that changed his features, the lifeless eyes that once shone with energy and purpose. She saw it all and knew, with a painful certainty, that she was to blame for every second of that suffering. At night, when the street noise subsided and the loneliness grew even heavier, Chloe allowed herself to cry. She cried for the life she had, for the love she had lost, for the impossible decision she had been forced to make. She constantly asked herself if she had made the right choice, if it was worth it, if there had really been another alternative. The questions spun in her mind like an endless carousel of guilt and regret. It was in October, 4 months after her disappearance, that Chloe discovered she was pregnant. The news came from a drugstore test she bought in a hurry when she noticed she was late. 2 pink lines. That changed everything. Chloe sat on the floor of the tiny bathroom, holding that piece of plastic, and felt a mixture of joy and absolute terror. It was Ethan's child, a piece of both of them growing inside her. The only good thing left from their destroyed relationship. For a few days, Chloe allowed herself to dream. She thought about raising the child alone, about being a mother, about having someone to love and who would love her back. The loneliness seemed less heavy. The future seemed less empty. She started eating better, taking better care of herself. She bought prenatal vitamins at a distant pharmacy. She made plans for what it would be like, how she would raise this child with all the love she could no longer give to Ethan. But the constant stress, the incessant fear, the corrosive guilt, it all took its toll. One November morning, Chloe woke up with intense pain and bleeding. She panicked, but she couldn't go to a hospital. She couldn't expose herself. She couldn't risk being recognized. She tried to handle the terrible situation on her own, but her body had already made its decision. Hours later, Chloe was curled up on the bathroom floor, lost in a pain that went far beyond the physical. She had lost the baby. She had lost the one thread of hope that had been keeping her minimally whole. The following days were the darkest. Chloe could barely get out of bed. She didn't eat, didn't sleep properly, saw no point in continuing. She seriously considered just showing up, going back, facing all the consequences. After all, what more was there to lose? She had already lost everything. But then she would remember the threats, the dangerous people, the real risk that still existed. And she would be paralyzed by fear all over again. It was in December, during one of her obsessive social media monitoring sessions, that Chloe saw something that brutally woke her up. A post from Leo, vague but worrying, about being strong for the one he loved, about not giving up even when all seemed lost. Chloe understood the subtext. Something had happened to Ethan, something serious. She spent hours searching for more information, connecting dots, accessing everything she could. She discovered through comments on posts, through veiled messages, that Ethan had reached a breaking point, that Leo had needed to intervene, that it had been a moment of extreme despair. Chloe felt as if her still-beating heart had been ripped from her chest. That was the limit. The guilt, already unbearable, multiplied 1,000-fold. She had done it to protect him, but she was destroying him from the inside out. The protection had turned into torture. Chloe realized she couldn't go on like this. She had to do something. She had to at least give him some sign that she had truly loved him, that this had all been an impossible sacrifice, not a cowardly escape. But how could she do it without completely exposing herself? How could she send signals without being found by the criminals who might still be looking for her? Chloe spent days planning. It had to be subtle, careful, but meaningful enough for Ethan to notice, for him to understand that there was something wrong with the whole story. On Christmas Eve, Chloe made her first move. She dressed in dark clothes, wore a scarf covering part of her face, and went to Greenwood Cemetery late at night. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure it could be heard from a distance. She walked to the headstone, that headstone with her own name on it, and left a bouquet of wildflowers, the same flowers Ethan used to bring her when they were younger, before they had money for imported roses. Simple yellow and white flowers, whose meaning only the two of them would know. Chloe stood there for a few minutes looking at that piece of marble that represented her own supposed ended existence, and whispered an apology to the cold night wind. Then she ran off, before her courage failed, before the tears completely blinded her. 2 days later, on Christmas morning, Ethan went to the cemetery as he did every day. When he saw the flowers, he stopped. His heart raced. He always brought white roses, the flowers Chloe had chosen for their wedding. But these weren't roses. They were wildflowers, the same flowers from the first time he had surprised her, at the beginning of their relationship, when he was just a broke but passionate student. How could anyone know that? Who would leave those exact flowers there? Ethan looked around, as if expecting to see someone, but the cemetery was practically empty on that holiday morning. He carefully picked up the bouquet, feeling the inexplicable weight of the gesture. There was something here, something that didn't make sense, but that also made all the sense in the world to his broken heart. A tiny spark of something he didn't even dare to name began to glow inside Ethan's devastated chest. It was the beginning of something that neither of them yet fully understood, but that would change everything all over again. The wildflowers were just the beginning of something Ethan couldn't yet fully comprehend. He spent the days after Christmas in a state of constant alert, a strange and unsettling feeling that something was happening beneath the visible surface of things, as if an undercurrent were pulling him in a direction he couldn't identify. He returned to the cemetery the day after Christmas, and the next, and the one after that. Each time, he observed everything with obsessive attention, searching for signs, clues, anything that could explain the mysterious bouquet. He studied every detail, the footprints on the dirt path leading to the headstone, the type of soil clinging to the flowers, the way they were tied. But nothing unusual happened in the following days, just the usual silence of the place and a few other people visiting their own lost loved ones, each immersed in their private grief. It was early January when the second sign appeared. Ethan arrived at the cemetery in the afternoon and found, next to the headstone, a small object that definitely hadn't been there when he made his daily visit that morning. It was a smooth, rounded river stone, hand-painted with a red heart in the center. Ethan picked up the stone with trembling hands. He and Chloe used to collect painted stones during their trips. It was a silly game that started on their honeymoon in Hawaii and became a tradition. Every trip, every outing, they would look for a special stone to paint together at night, always with a symbol that represented that moment. Who the hell knew about this? Who knew such intimate details of a private relationship? Ethan looked around again, this time with more urgency. Was someone watching? Was someone testing his sanity? Or was it possible, and he barely dared to think it, that Chloe had told these details to someone before she was gone? A close friend? A family member? But why would someone do this now, months later? What was the point? Ethan pocketed the stone and left the cemetery more disturbed than ever. At home, Leo immediately noticed his brother's altered state. When Ethan showed him the stone and told him about the flowers, Leo carefully suggested that maybe they were just coincidences, that someone might be leaving random gifts, that grief sometimes makes the mind look for patterns where none exist. But even as he said it, Leo didn't seem convinced. There was something in his voice that betrayed doubt, uncertainty, maybe even a hint of impossible hope. Over the following weeks of January and February, the signs continued to appear with a regularity that was both comforting and disturbing. A note with a quote from a book only the two of them had read together, a novel about astronomy they bought at an independent bookstore in the Berkshires, left discreetly among the flowers Ethan always brought. An old photo of them, taken at the beginning of their relationship, when they were still living in dorms and barely had money to eat out, placed in an unmarked manila envelope inside their apartment's mailbox. The photo showed the two of them in a park, sitting on the grass, her head resting on his shoulder, both smiling at the camera with the uncomplicated happiness of youth. Each new sign wrung a contradictory mix of desperate hope and absolute confusion from Ethan, leaving him emotionally exhausted. He didn't know what to think, couldn't process what it all meant, what to do with this information that suggested the impossible. Leo noticed his brother's increasingly agitated state and began to seriously worry about his mental health. He gently suggested that Ethan see a therapist, someone who could help him process his grief in a healthier way. But Ethan refused. How could he explain to a therapist that he thought his wife might be alive, that he was receiving mysterious signs that only made sense to the two of them? He would sound completely insane. It was when Ethan decided to investigate more deeply that the pieces started not to fit. He went back to the records of the supposed incident, requested copies of documents, and spoke with the officers who had responded to the scene. And the more he investigated, the more inconsistencies he found. The forensic report seemed too superficial. Details that should have been there were missing. The doctor who had signed some of the documents, Dr. Wallace, had apparently vanished. No one knew where he was. His professional registration indicated he had retired years ago, and there was no way to contact him. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. What if this had all been a sham? What if Chloe hadn't really been gone? The idea was absurd, but it also made a twisted kind of sense he couldn't ignore. Why had Chloe been acting so strangely in the months before? Why the fear, the locked doors, the whispered phone calls? What if she had discovered something dangerous? What if she had needed to disappear? But then came the wave of anger. If Chloe was alive, if this was all an act, how could she do this to him? How could she let him suffer like that, believing he had lost her, living a grief that tore his soul apart day after day? What kind of love allows for that level of cruelty? Ethan oscillated between hope and fury, between the desire to find her and the desire to never see her again. Chloe, from her hiding place, followed everything on her computer. She had installed discreet cameras in the cemetery, disguised among the trees, which allowed her to see when Ethan visited. She saw him find every sign she left, saw the confusion on his face, the way he held each object as if it was sacred. Every time she saw that pain mixed with hope, Chloe hated herself a little more. But she had to continue. She needed to prepare Ethan for the truth, even if it meant making him doubt everything first. Because the truth would be devastating, and she knew it. There was no gentle way to reveal that it had all been planned, that she had chosen to make him suffer. So Chloe kept leaving clues like breadcrumbs in a dark forest, hoping Ethan would find his way to her when he was ready. What Chloe didn't know was that her movements were not going unnoticed. The men who had threatened her months ago, those involved in the corruption scheme she had uncovered, had started paying attention again. They kept a discreet watch on anything related to Miller and Davis, hoping Chloe would eventually make a mistake if she was still alive. And when they noticed Ethan's strange visits to the cemetery, when they saw him going to police precincts and courthouses requesting documents, they suspected something was up. Jackson Cole was the man in charge of solving these kinds of problems. a corrupt ex-cop who now worked as a fixer for powerful people who preferred to stay in the shadows. He was called in to investigate Ethan. He started following him, monitoring his movements, intercepting his communications. It took 3 weeks for Cole to find something interesting. Security camera footage from near the cemetery showed a woman in dark clothes wearing a brown wig, appearing at the same times. The mysterious objects were being left. Cole enlarged the images as much as he could. The quality wasn't great, the woman's face was always partially covered, but there was something familiar about her. Her posture, the way she walked, something he couldn't quite place but that set off alarms in his head. He decided to report back to his clients. If Chloe Miller was alive, that changed everything. It meant she still had the evidence of the scheme, she was still a threat, and she still needed to be neutralized once and for all. It was on a February afternoon that Chloe made her first serious mistake. She was leaving another note at the cemetery, this time risking a daytime visit because she needed to make sure Ethan found it before it rained. She was so focused on placing the envelope in the right spot that she didn't notice the man watching from a distance, capturing everything with a telephoto lens. Cole now had almost conclusive proof. The woman in the images looked a lot like Chloe. He just needed final confirmation. That same night, Ethan received a text message from an unknown number. Short and direct. "She's alive. Be careful. You're being watched." Ethan froze, staring at his phone screen. Who had sent this? Was it true? Was it some kind of scam or manipulation? But the message confirmed the suspicions already growing in his chest. Chloe was alive. She was out there, somewhere, alive and aware of the suffering she had caused. Ethan didn't tell Leo about the message. He didn't tell anyone. He needed to process it alone first. If Chloe was alive, she had her reasons for doing what she did, reasons he didn't know yet, and if he was being watched, he had to be careful. He couldn't put Chloe in danger by acting impulsively, so Ethan started to plan. He acted normally during the day, maintaining his work routine and visits to the cemetery, but at night, he began looking for ways to contact Chloe. He left coded messages on social media, using references only the two of them would understand. He created anonymous profiles and started posting seemingly random things that were loaded with meaning for anyone who knew his history with Chloe. Chloe saw them. Of course she did. She obsessively monitored everything related to Ethan. And when she identified his messages, when she realized he was trying to reach her, that he understood she was alive, Chloe felt a mix of relief and terror. The moment she had both dreaded and longed for was coming. They would have to meet. They would have to talk. She would have to explain the inexplicable. But Chloe also saw something else. She noticed strange patterns in the views on her posts from the fake profiles. A few specific profiles always viewed her posts minutes after she published them. Profiles with no photos, no friends, clearly fake. Someone was tracking her online. The criminals were closing in again. And if they found Ethan trying to contact her, if they discovered they were communicating, they would both be in danger. Chloe had to make a quick decision. She could no longer communicate with Ethan remotely. It was too risky. If they were going to meet, it had to be in person, in a safe place where they could talk without being tracked. So Chloe did something she hadn't done in 8 months. She sent a direct message to Ethan's number from a burner phone. A single sentence. "The Hamptons house, Friday at midnight, come alone." Ethan was in a meeting when he received the message. He looked at the screen and felt his heart nearly pound out of his chest. It was her. It had to be her. No one else would know about the beach house. No one else would specifically choose that place that meant so much to both of them. Ethan could barely pay attention to the rest of the meeting. His mind was already in the Hamptons, imagining the reunion, preparing what he would say, trying to control the emotions that threatened to explode at any moment. Friday arrived heavy with tension. Ethan made up an excuse for Leo about needing to handle company business out of town. He left the apartment at 9 p.m., driving his car along the dark highways to the coast. It was almost 120 miles, a 2-hour drive that felt like an eternity. Each mile heightened his anxiety. What would he say to Chloe? How would he react when he saw her? Would he hug her or scream at her? Would he cry with joy or with rage? Chloe arrived at the beach house an hour before the agreed time. She needed to make sure she hadn't been followed, that the place was secure. The house was exactly as she remembered, a little dusty from disuse, but preserving all the memories of happy weekends. Chloe walked through the rooms, touching furniture, feeling the weight of nostalgia. This house held the version of them that no longer existed, the version before everything fell apart. At midnight sharp, Chloe heard the sound of a car pulling up. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. It was real, it was really happening. Ethan was there just a few feet away, after 8 months of forced and painful separation. Chloe stood in the living room, waiting, unsure if her legs would hold her up when he walked in. The door opened slowly. Ethan stepped inside and turned on the living room light. And then their eyes met. Chloe, without the wig, without the glasses, her natural hair in a state that showed months of neglect but unmistakably alive. Ethan froze in place. All the words he had prepared vanished from his mind. All he could manage to do was whisper, his voice breaking, "Chloe?" She nodded, tears already streaming down her face. She took a step toward him, but Ethan held up a hand, stopping her. There was something in his eyes that Chloe recognized immediately. Pain. A deep pain that had turned into anger. Ethan wasn't relieved. He was furious. "You're alive," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "You're alive and you let me believe that you had—" The words failed him, but his body was visibly trembling. Chloe tried to speak, to explain, but Ethan continued, "8 months, Chloe. For 8 months, I lived through hell. I visited your grave every single day. I thought I had lost you. I thought my life had ended with yours. And the whole time you were out there hiding, watching me suffer." "Ethan, I can explain," Chloe began, but he cut her off again. "Explain? What explanation could there possibly be for this? What explanation justifies putting me through this?" "I was protecting you," Chloe finally managed to shout, her own anger and desperation surfacing. "I discovered something terrible. Dangerous people threatened me. They threatened you. I had no choice." And then it all came pouring out. Chloe told him about the corruption she had uncovered, about the embezzled funds, about the increasingly explicit threats. She told him about the constant fear, about the feeling of being followed, about the certainty that something bad would happen if she didn't disappear. She spoke about the plan with Dr. Wallace, about how hard it was to execute, about every lonely day in her hiding place. And then, her voice breaking, she told him about the pregnancy, about the child they would have had together, the child she lost alone, unable to tell anyone, without his comfort in her darkest moments. That revelation broke something in Ethan. He sank heavily onto the couch, put his face in his hands and began to sob. Chloe knelt before him, taking his hands, and they cried together for the first time in 8 months. That's when they heard the sound of cars pulling up outside. A lot of cars. Chloe froze. She recognized that sound. She had heard it before, that night she was first followed. She looked at Ethan, panic in her eyes. "They found us!" The front door was kicked in violently. 3 men burst in, with Jackson Cole in the lead. He looked at Chloe with a cruel smile. "Welcome back from the dead, Chloe. You have something that belongs to my employers." Chloe squeezed Ethan's hand. It was all over. But then Ethan did something no one expected. With surprising calm, he pulled his phone from his pocket and, before any of the men could react, pressed a button. Immediately, the red light of a live broadcast began to flash on the screen. "We're live on the Miller and Davis social media channels," Ethan said in a firm voice, pointing the phone at the intruders. 63,000 followers are watching right now. Anything you do will be seen and recorded." Jackson Cole's face went pale. The situation had spun completely out of his control. The red light of the live broadcast blinked like a beacon in the suffocating tension that filled the room. Jackson Cole glanced at the 2 men with him, his confidence momentarily shattered. He hadn't expected this. No one had. The plan was simple: get in, retrieve the documents Chloe had gathered, and solve the problem once and for all. But now, there were witnesses, thousands of them, and the number on Ethan's phone screen kept climbing every second. 71,000 people, Ethan announced, his voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "You're being watched live. Do you really want to do something that will be recorded and used as evidence against you?" Chloe stood beside Ethan, her body trembling but her mind racing. She knew men like Cole. She knew the kind of violence they were capable of when cornered, but she also knew their survival instinct. And no smart criminal makes a mistake in front of live cameras with thousands of witnesses. Cole took a step back, reassessing. He could see from the comments flooding the stream that people were already calling the police, sharing the location, recording everything. He had completely lost control of the situation. With a sharp gesture to the other two men, he retreated toward the door. "This isn't over," he snarled, before leaving, his words more a desperate attempt to maintain some illusion of power than a real threat. Ethan kept the broadcast running even after the men had gone. He spoke directly to the camera, quickly explaining who Chloe was, that she was alive, that she had uncovered a corruption scheme involving the embezzlement of funds from social projects. He talked about the threats, the fear, the impossible decision she had to make. He didn't go into every detail, but he gave enough information for people to understand the gravity of the situation. The comments exploded on the screen. There was disbelief, outrage, support, criticism, but most importantly, there was attention. The case was now in the public spotlight in a way that would be impossible to suppress. Chloe held Ethan's hand as he spoke, tears streaming silently down her face. She knew nothing would ever be the same after tonight, but at least they were together and they were alive. The police arrived 20 minutes later, alerted by the thousands of followers watching the stream. Multiple squad cars showed up, including federal agents, because the case involved corruption and the misuse of public funds. Ethan and Chloe had to give long statements right there, in the beach house that was supposed to be a refuge, but had become the stage for a dramatic turning point. Cole and the other two men were caught on the highway, trying to flee back to New York City. With them, the police found weapons, incriminating documents, and a direct link to the politicians and business leaders involved in the scheme. Chloe handed over all the evidence she had gathered months ago, including the long-hidden flash drive. From that point on, it would only be a matter of time before the entire corruption network was dismantled. But the public exposure brought consequences that neither Chloe nor Ethan had fully anticipated. By Saturday morning, the story was on every news channel. Chloe Miller, the woman who came back from the dead to expose a corruption ring. The dramatic angle was irresistible to the media. Journalists camped out in front of their Park Slope apartment. Their phones rang off the hook. Miller and Davis was once again at the center of attention, but now for entirely different reasons. The public reaction was mixed and intense. Many supported Chloe, seeing her as a hero who sacrificed everything to expose criminals. Others criticized her harshly for faking her own death, for the suffering she caused Ethan and everyone who loved her. There were heated debates on social media about ethics, about the limits of what is acceptable even when in danger. Chloe read it all, every comment, every opinion, and each criticism cut her like a deep wound. Inside the company, the chaos was even greater. Jessica Carter called an emergency meeting with the entire team. Employees who had wept at Chloe's memorial service now didn't know how to react. There was relief that she was alive, but also anger over the lie. There was confusion about what this meant for the future of the company, and there was fear about the consequences of the investigations that were sure to come. Leo arrived at the beach house mid-afternoon on Saturday, having driven like a madman when he heard the news. He burst through the door and found Chloe and Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, exhausted, drinking cold coffee. When he saw Chloe, alive and real, Leo froze for a long moment, then he exploded. "You're alive," he yelled, and it wasn't with joy. "You're alive, and you let my brother nearly kill himself over you? Do you have any idea of the hell he went through, that we all went through?" Chloe tried to speak, but Leo wouldn't let her. Everything he had held in for months came out in a torrent of angry words. He talked about the nights he stayed up holding Ethan while he cried, about the employees who were laid off because the company was failing, about the families who struggled because the projects were shut down, about how he, Leo, had to be strong for everyone, while also grieving the loss of someone he considered a sister. Ethan finally stopped his brother, placing a hand on his shoulder. That's enough, Leo. I know you're angry. I am too, but she had her reasons. Reasons that neither you nor I can fully judge because we weren't in her shoes. Leo looked at his brother, incredulous. You're defending her after everything. I'm not defending her. I'm trying to understand, Ethan replied calmly. And you should try too. It was the beginning of many difficult conversations that would take place over the following months. Conversations that sometimes ended in shouting, sometimes in tears, sometimes in heavy silence. There was no manual for this situation. How do you recover from such a massive lie? How do you rebuild trust when the foundation has been completely shattered? Chloe and Ethan returned to New York on Sunday, facing the avalanche of media attention. They had to deal with the professional consequences before they could even begin to deal with the personal ones. Miller and Davis was under investigation. All their accounts were temporarily frozen. External auditors were brought in to review every project, every transaction, every document from the last 5 years. The process was painful and exposing. They discovered that 3 employees had indeed been involved in the scheme, taking bribes to manipulate reports and facilitate the embezzlement. Chloe had trusted these people, had hired them personally. The betrayal was an additional layer of pain she had to process. But the audit also brought relief. The vast majority of the company was clean. The scheme was localized, involving only the specific project in the South Bronx and a few smaller contracts. The essence of Miller and Davis, the genuine work they did, remained intact. Still, their reputation was tarnished. Partners pulled away. Some contracts were cancelled due to image clauses. The recovery would be long and difficult. It was Chloe who had the idea to turn the crisis into an opportunity. In a tense meeting with Jessica, Leo, and Ethan, she proposed something radical. Publicly own the mistake of not having seen the scheme sooner and transform the company into a model of transparency and integrity. They would create rigorous internal audit protocols. They would establish a whistleblower protection program so no employee would ever feel threatened for exposing wrongdoing. They would open all their processes to public scrutiny through detailed quarterly reports. People are going to distrust us anyway, Chloe argued, so let's give them concrete reasons to trust us again. Let's be so transparent that it will be impossible to doubt our integrity. Jessica was the first to support the idea. Leo, still reluctant but recognizing the logic, agreed. Ethan looked at Chloe and saw something in her he hadn't seen in a long time: determination. The woman he had known, the one who didn't back down from a challenge, was slowly returning. But the professional rebuilding, as hard as it was simpler than the personal one. Chloe and Ethan tried to live together again in the Park Slope apartment, but the tension was unbearable. Every room held memories of before, when everything was simple and honest. Now distrust hung in the air like a toxic fog. Ethan had nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night thinking Chloe was gone again, that it was all just a cruel dream. Chloe had panic attacks triggered by cars stopping in front of the building, by calls from unknown numbers, by anything that reminded her of the months of terror she had lived through. They were both broken in different ways, trying to piece themselves back together, but unsure if the parts still fit. It was the idea of a therapist they both started seeing, individually and as a couple, to move temporarily to a new place. No memories, no ghosts. They rented a smaller apartment in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in a walk-up on a quiet street. There they began to rebuild from scratch, like strangers learning to know each other all over again. The first few weeks were awkward and uncomfortable, superficial conversations about the weather, about work, carefully avoiding the topics that hurt too much. Slowly, they began to venture into deeper territory. Chloe shared details about her months in hiding that she hadn't shared before. Ethan talked about his darkest days, about the moments he didn't want to go on. Each conversation was painful, but also necessary. They were like a surgeon's scalpel, opening old wounds so they could finally heal properly. Chloe took on a new role at the company, no longer the charming COO everyone loved. Now she was the guardian of integrity, the person in charge of implementing and overseeing all the new transparency protocols. It was a role that suited her need to make peace with the mistakes that, while not directly hers, had happened under her watch. Ethan returned to leading strategy, but with a different approach, less focused on growth at all costs, more attentive to the quality and ethics of each partnership. 6 months after that dramatic night in the Hamptons, Chloe and Ethan called a meeting with all the company's employees. It was held in the auditorium they used to rent for large events with all 42 employees present. Chloe and Ethan stood on the small stage side by side, but with a distance between them that hadn't been there before. Chloe spoke first. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I know I owe all of you an apology for the lie, for the suffering I caused, for the instability I brought into your lives. Nothing I can say will undo that. But I want you to know that I carry the weight of those choices every single day, and I am committed to doing things differently from now on." Ethan followed, speaking about the company's new direction, about their renewed commitment to transparency, about how grateful he was for the loyalty of everyone who had stayed through the toughest times. Then, in a surprising move, he announced a profit-sharing program. Every employee would receive a percentage of the company's profits, proportional to their time with the company. It was a concrete way to say thank you, but also to share responsibility and success. There were tears at that meeting, some of anger not yet fully digested, others of relief, many of hope. It didn't solve everything, but it was a milestone, a turning point where everyone decided it was worth trying to rebuild together. The story of Chloe and Ethan took on a life of its own on social media and in the news. It became a case study at universities on business ethics. It inspired debates about how far someone can go to protect themselves. It divided opinions on talk shows. But within Miller and Davis, it gradually transformed into something else. A symbol that it's possible to fall and get back up, to make mistakes and correct them, to be broken and put yourself back together. Not all the damage could be repaired. Old friends of the couple drifted away, unable to handle the complexity of the situation. Some of Chloe's relatives in particular never fully forgave her. Lawsuits continued for months, both against those involved in the scheme, and some filed against the company itself for damages caused during the crisis. Their emotional health fluctuated, with bouts of anxiety, sleepless nights, and moments of relapse. The love between Chloe and Ethan, that quiet, secure love from before, was gone. It couldn't exist anymore. But something new was growing in its place. A more complex, more painful, but also more honest love. A love that had seen rock bottom and decided it was still worth it. They learned that forgiveness isn't a single moment of decision, but a continuous process of choosing every day not to let the past define the present. It was almost a year after the night in the Hamptons that Chloe and Ethan returned to Greenwood Cemetery together. The headstone with her name was still there, a bizarre monument to a person who was alive. They stood there, hand in hand, looking at the marble slab that represented so much error, so much fear, so much suffering. "We should have it removed," Chloe said softly. "It doesn't make sense for it to be here." But Ethan shook his head. "No, let it stay. That's not you in there. It's who we were before, the people we were and can never be again." Chloe understood. That headstone was the grave not of a person, but of a version of their lives. The naive version that believed love and hard work were enough. The version that didn't know betrayal, fear, or impossible choices. That version had disappeared on that June night almost 2 years ago, and maybe it was better to let it rest in peace. They turned to leave, but Chloe stopped and looked at Ethan. "Have you forgiven me?" she asked, knowing it was an unfair question, but needing to hear the answer anyway. Ethan thought for a long moment before replying. "I'm trying. Some days I can. Other days, the anger comes back. But I'm trying, Chloe. And I think that has to be enough for now." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "And you? Can you forgive yourself?" he asked in return. Chloe looked up at the sky, at the clouds drifting slowly over New York. "I'm trying too. And some days when I see the new projects working, when I see the families being truly helped this time, with transparency and dignity, on those days, I can believe that maybe it was worth it, that something good was born from all this destruction." They walked back to the car in a comfortable silence. It wasn't the heavy silence of before, laden with unsaid things. It was the silence of two people who had said everything that needed to be said, who knew each other's wounds and who chose to be together anyway. The city of New York continued its frantic pace around them, millions of stories happening simultaneously, each with its own pains and joys, defeats and victories. Chloe and Ethan were just two more people trying to find meaning in a world that rarely made sense. But at least they weren't doing it alone anymore. And maybe, in the end, that's what true love meant. Not the absence of flaws or pain, but the courage to face them both together, day after day, choice after choice. The sun was setting over the city as they left the cemetery, painting the sky. In shades of orange and pink, it was a new evening, the beginning of another night, and then another day would come, and another, and another. And with each day, Chloe and Ethan would choose whether it was worth it to keep choosing each other. Not because it was easy or because everything was fixed, but because they had learned in the hardest way possible that real love isn't defined by the absence of storms, but by the willingness to hold each other's hands even when the boat is sinking and to rebuild after the waters calm. End of story. We hope the story of Chloe and Ethan touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of love, pain, forgiveness and rebuilding, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you the most. What would you have done in Chloe's place? Could you forgive in Ethan's? Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, the impossible dilemmas we all face, and the extraordinary capacity we have to reinvent ourselves even after the greatest falls. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on the complexity of love and human choices.